Thanks for having me today. This is actually one of the first times that I've shared my testimony publicly, my full testimony, so this is very exciting. So, in case you guys missed it, my name is Reema, and I grew up in a Shia Muslim family just out in Richmond. My mother and father were born and raised in Iraq, and during the reign of Saddam Hussein, they actually fled as refugees to London, which is where they got married and had my sister. And not long after that, they immigrated to Canada and settled here in BC, which is where they had me. My mother was a very hard-working woman. And from the very rough circumstances that was her life, she, sort of worked her way up into a very secure and prestigious position as a doctor at a hospital. And because of her and all of her hard work, our family was actually really well off. But when I think about my earliest childhood memories, it's not memories of the overseas expensive vacations and the gifts that we'd receive that really come to mind, but rather it's the endless yelling and fighting and screaming and abuse that would go on within the walls of what I was supposed to call home. You see, growing up, I really feared my parents, like to the core. And coming here today, I really struggled in choosing a story to share with you that might just demonstrate how bad it was for me. I think this one might do the trick. I was about 8 or 9 years old, and I had done something to upset my mother. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but I think it was something like I didn't do my Kumon homework or something. And she was really upset by it, and she takes me into the kitchen, and she pulls out this butter knife. She turns on the stovetop, and she puts the knife on the stovetop, and she turns to me and she says, "Reema, when that knife turns red hot, I'm going to take it and chase you around the house and press it onto your skin." Yeah, so I ran and I hid under our table somewhere in the house, terrified that she might actually do it. And she didn't, by the way, which was good, but how things were in the family up until this point in my life made it so that I honestly believed that was something she was capable of. And from that very young age into my teenage years, and even up till the point that I left, my parents had this obsessive need to control every aspect of my life. Like the clothes that I wore, the friends that I had, how I chose to spend my free time, even the classes that I would come to register in university. Just every single aspect of my life. They just needed to have a direct say in it. And time again, if I failed to uphold those expectations of my life, I knew I would be punished for it in one way or another. Sometimes it was physical. Other times it was some sort of emotional or verbal abuse. And it would always leave me feeling so incredibly unloved and unsafe and rejected. Needless to say, I spent most of my time at home up in my room. And it was up in my room that I was down on my knees and praying about it and crying about it to God, to Allah. You see, but in many ways, my relationship with Allah was very similar to the relationship I had with my parents. Allah, too, had all of these expectations of me as a Muslim, and I knew that if I failed to uphold those expectations, I'd be held accountable and punished for it in one way or another. I did believe that God was merciful and that he was just. I just certainly didn't believe that his love was just something that was handed to me. It was something that I needed to work really hard to earn. It was very similar to the love my parents had offered me. Our family, we were really devout Muslims. For those of you who don't know, the term Muslim really means to submit. To submit to what? Well, the will of Allah, which also means following the sunnah, or the example as set by the Prophet Muhammad. And we did that. We prayed our 5 daily prayers during the month of Ramadan. We would fast. The women in my family, we wore hijab and we dressed modestly. We practiced the recitation of the Quran, and we also attended the mosque on a fairly regular basis. And at the mosque, my parents were always on their best behavior, which made things a lot worse for my sister and I, because when we would go around complaining about what was going on at home, no one believed us. And what made things worse is that in Islam, there's this quote, "Heaven lies under the feet of your mother." I'm sure most of the Muslims here and ex-Muslims that are here and listening have heard it. And the idea is pretty simple. Well, if you please your mother, well, you got a good chance of getting yourself into heaven, right? See, the problem was I couldn't please my mother no matter how hard I tried, and now that I had pretty much left, you see, I got to a point where I needed to leave. It got really, really difficult for me at one point. You see, my sister and I, we had entered into our adult years. So naturally, we began claiming some independence over our life. And I was a pretty devout Muslim at that time too. I felt that if I wanted to leave that situation, I needed to devote myself completely to God. And through obeying Him and by pleasing Him, I would earn His favor. And that He would sort of owe it to me to deliver me out of that hell of a situation. And so I did that. I prayed hours each day in prayer, and before and after each prayer, I would recite the recommended supplications, and I would read the entire Quran in Ramadan from cover to cover, and I would carry my subha, or my rosary beads, with me around everywhere, even to my public high school, where I'd hide them in my pocket or under the table, and I'd recite God's praises over and over and over again. And before I would recite my daily prayers, I would do the wudu, or the ritual wash that you're supposed to do. I'd go to the washroom, and I would get to the part where I'm supposed to wash my arms and make sure that all the water would just flow down and not a single droplet would go up my arm, because if that happened, it supposedly invalidated my wash. And if it invalidated my wash, it invalidated my prayer. And if it invalidated my prayer, well, then I was in trouble with God, wasn't I? And things continued like that for a while I was at home. And I felt like I needed to dedicate that part of my life to God, because when my sister and I would go around, as I've described before how important the status of mother is in Islam, when my sister and I would go around and we would speak ill of her, trying to get help, trying to seek refuge in our community, they would say to me, "Don't speak that way about your mother. How dare you speak that way about her? You should be grateful for her, and you should be ashamed of yourself." And so I was. I was ashamed of myself. And so for a time, I just learned to pray about it and to dedicate my life to Islam so that God would help me, right? God would deliver me out of that situation. And I waited for it to get better. It didn't. It got a lot worse. See, my sister and I, like I said, we had become adults, and so we wanted to claim some independence over our life. And my mother, she didn't like that. I remember she told me at one specific point, yelling at me in this exact issue, she said, "Reema, I want you to tie something around your wrists. I want you to tie something around your ankles. I want you to blindfold yourself, and I want you to say, 'Mama, ihdini,' which means mother, guide me." And so I knew if I wanted any say in my life whatsoever, I would need to leave. And so I did. I ran away. I'm not sure if I can call it running away. I was 18 at the time, but it certainly felt like that. And I'm going to spare you guys the very messy details of the situations that transpired when I left. But at least I was out, right? I found myself a small apartment in the heart of Newton, Surrey. One of the shadiest places to live, by the way. My neighbors consisted of drug dealers and addicts and alcoholics. And I swear around the corner there were always these prostitutes there, and somehow it was the first place that I ever lived that actually felt safe. And it was the first place that I lived that I actually called home. Those first couple of months that I was out, I did okay, I managed. I was certainly now overjoyed at the basic freedoms that I now had in my life. I remember the first time I went grocery shopping after I left, I actually broke down crying in the detergent section, because I can now choose my own detergent. I know that seems silly to probably most of you that are here and listening, but it's not. Not after you go your entire life without making a basic decision for yourself. And after that, things were good. Things were good until they weren't, because I started having these really bad nightmares about my past. And I developed this really bad anxiety, this sort of crippling anxiety that would prevent me from doing anything and going anywhere. I remember on one occasion the imam, or the sheikh, The Muslim leader of the mosque, he contacted me and he said, Reema, I really think you should go see your father this weekend. He wouldn't tell me why, but it sounded really urgent. He made it sound as though my father was terribly sick or something. And I wrestled with, if I should do that or not, and I decided that I would, because I wanted to do something right by Allah. But coming up to that weekend that I was supposed to go and see him, I was so distraught with anxiety and panic that I nearly threw myself in front of a car. I guess I would have rather died at that point in my life than to have encountered my parents again. I remember after that very scary moment, I walked into my college campus, and I walked towards my microbiology class, and this guy comes up to me. We had an assignment to work on or something, and he sees this terrified look on my face. He says, Reema, are you okay? And I just start screaming at the top of my lungs and crying. And I'm on the floor now, and I'm this screaming, crying, inconsolable mess. And before I know it, the first aid is there and security is there. They blocked off the entire part of the biology department, and I stay that way on the floor until paramedics come. And they take me away. And the next 2 weeks I spend in a mental health facility where they tell me I have something called post-traumatic stress disorder, which I thought was funny because I thought that was something only soldiers got after they came back from war. So they put me on all of these medications, and I had a very strict exercise and therapy regimen. And in a few months, I was actually doing better. Things started to look up. At this point in my life, it was about 1 year to 2 years after I had left, and I was a still pretty devout Muslim. But something very significant had changed. The guilt had settled in. Like I said before, there's this quote, heaven lies under the feet of your mother. The status of mother is so important in Islam. And so, if I had disappointed my mother that much and that matter was so important to God, he must be furious with me, right? And that made me feel guilty. But you know what the most irritating part was? I was the victim of the situation, and yet I was the one left feeling guilty. And I thought, what's the point? If God is already upset with me, what's the point in me going through all of this other trouble to follow all of these other rules if I'm already pretty much condemned, right? I may as well stop trying to please God and start trying to please myself. So I did that. I stopped praying. Soon after that, I stopped fasting. I even started drinking alcohol. And by the way, the first time that I ever had alcohol, I half expected my body to just burst into flames right then and there. It didn't happen, which was good, but then I had a dilemma because then I was a Muslim hijabi girl that was drinking alcohol. You can't have that, right? So I took my hijab off. And slowly and surely, whatever love that I felt God had for me had disappeared. I actually felt that God started to hate me. One thing hadn't changed. I still loved God. It's just that he didn't love me back. It's so funny. I even believed that he would orchestrate these situations in my life to try to get me to actually hate him so that he could punish me even more. Like he would deal with me a really tough day, and at the end of the day, I would turn my head to the heavens and say, "Ha God, nice try. I still love you. Try again, because I still love you." Things continued like that for a number of years. Some weeks I was actually happy. Other weeks not so much. It all depended where I put my happiness and identity in that week. Some weeks it was in myself, like believe in yourself. Other weeks it was in my friends or my relationships. Other weeks it was in my stellar reputation as a student. But on the days that I would wake up and I would look in the mirror and I'd think that I'm ugly, or on the days that my relationships felt really rocky, or on the days that I got a test back and God forbid it wasn't an A+, all my happiness and security be right out the window. Turns out if you put your happiness in something that is temporary, your happiness will only ever be temporary. Fast forward to a couple of years back, I'm sitting and I'm having dinner with a friend of mine who just so happens to be a Christian. He says, "Reema, I've also gone through a very rough time in my life, And I don't know where I would be if it wasn't for Jesus. Yeah, okay. I sat there and I smiled and I nodded at him politely, but really I'm thinking to myself, man, this guy is crazy. But he invited me to church and I went. I mean, he wasn't in town on that particular day, so I went alone. I hop in the bus in the pouring rain. Some hour later, I get there, get off the bus, I walk in the church, and all these people greet me, and they're so incredibly nice. And I sit next to this really nice couple, and the service begins, and the music comes up. All of a sudden, everyone's standing, and they're singing, and they're dancing, and they're waving their hands in the air and clapping. And I'm thinking to myself, what did I just walk into? Because, by the way, for those of you who don't know, music is actually forbidden in Islam. And so for me to go to a place of worship and see that there was actually music there being celebrated and used to glorify the Lord, that was very, very bizarre to me. But anyways, I'm standing there awkwardly and I'm reading the words on the screen, and it's something about Son of God, whoever that is. Something about him dying on the cross for my sins, whatever that meant. And I left that day not with a sense of peace or with a sense of grand epiphany that I was secretly hoping for, but really it was a sense of anger. Anger because what I had just witnessed as a Muslim, I knew to be blasphemy. Like utter blasphemy. But if it was blasphemy, then why did I find it so intriguingly beautiful? And that really confused me. And so I decided I would do the only thing I knew how to do, being a student for so long. I was going to study the issue. I was going to look at the issue from a mere studious perspective. At that point in my life, it was in the second year of my veterinary technology program, and I had all of these tests and quizzes and assignments to study for. But somehow I knew that this was far more important. At the start of my research, I thought, hey, there's no point in me looking into the case of the gospel of Christ if I'm so convicted of my Islamic beliefs, which I was. I mean, I may not have been a practicing Muslim at this time, but I certainly was convicted at the basic fundamental truths that lay within Islam. But it wasn't very long into my research of Islam that the foundation of what I thought was the truth had begun to crumble right before my eyes. And then I was really lost and like angry and frustrated. And I remember one night I go for my evening run and it's super dark and it's pouring rain. And at one point I just stop and I just look at the heavens and I just start yelling at God, like, God, why? Why? My life has been one trial after the other the entire time, and now I'm starting to realize that my entire life has pretty much been a lie. Why, God? God, I'm so hurt. I'm so broken. I'm so lonely. I have no one. And now I don't even know who you are, which I thought that I did, but I guess not. And God, I know that you must love truth seekers. So God, I need to know who you are. Won't you show me who you are? In the early months of 2020, I, for some reason, found myself at home a lot. And suddenly I had all this free time and energy and freedom to turn my research towards the case of Christ and the gospel. And within the few months that I was at home, I learned a lot. I mean, I'd love to share with you some of what I had learned that's far beyond the scope of my testimony today, but every day that I was researching, the most incredible argument, the most compelling argument to have ever been made for any religion was unfolding right before my eyes. See, because did you know that you could actually prove that Christianity is true? You can. You just need to prove three things. That Jesus Christ did claim that he was God, that he did die on the cross, and that he was resurrected. If you can prove those three things, game over. Christianity is right. And I found the most compelling argument for all of those points. And so it became clear to me that, hey, this is something, to my surprise, that might actually be very rational to believe in. One of the things, though, that I had a lot of issues in comprehending, and I think a lot of Muslims and probably even Christians have issues comprehending this too, is the divinity of Christ. You know, the idea that this character of Jesus Christ can be 100% God and 100% man at the same time, I mean, that made no sense to me. How could God, in all of his glory, in all of his majesty, in all of his greatness, condescend himself into man? Man that feels pain, man that could be tempted by Satan, man that can bleed. No, God can't do that, right? God is too great for that. And then one day it just occurred to me, wait a minute. Who am I to tell God what he can or cannot do? I mean, if for whatever reason he wants to descend and be mad, who am I to say, no, God, that's impossible for you. You can't do that. I mean, he can do anything. That's the whole point, right? He's God. Yeah. So maybe it's not a matter of how God could do that, but why? Why would God do that? One day in a search for an answer for that question, I came across this imagery in a book that completely changed my perspective of God. And I want to share it with you. It describes an image of a mother and a daughter, and they're dressed in the most lavish and expensive clothes. Let's say they're going to a wedding or something. And if on the way there, the daughter stumbles and she falls into a pile of mud, does the mother keep walking, or does she try to help her girl? Well, of course, she tries to help her girl. Now, does she send someone else to help the girl? Does she help the girl herself? I think you guys get the point here. The mother loves and values the daughter far much more than she values the glory and majesty of her own clothes, that without a second's hesitation, she gets on the daughter's level, in the mud with her, and she pulls the daughter out and saves her herself. That's how great the love of a good mother is for a daughter. And if that's the love of a mother, then how much more is the love of God? So maybe it's not despite the fact that God is so great, he condescends himself into man. Maybe it's because of the fact that God is so great and how great his love is, he condescends himself into man so that he can get on our level in this big mud pile that we've all gotten ourselves into in one way or another, so to speak, and pull us out of it himself. That's how great the love of God is. It began becoming apparent to me that maybe in God's eyes, we are far much more precious to him than his own majesty. And that changed my entire perspective of who I thought God to be. Because you see, up till this point, I believed that God was more of a master and that I was his slave. The Quran implies over and over again that the closest relationship that man can have to God is that of a slave and master relationship. But evidentially speaking, right, if God is capable of that sort of pure and uncomplicated and unconditional and sort of sacrificial and intimate kind of love, that's not describing the kind of love that a master has towards a slave, is it? That's describing the kind of love that a father has towards a child. And God is a relational being. So changing my perspective of how I saw God was directly changing my perspective of how I saw myself. Because if it's God the Father and not God the Master, then I'm not a slave of God, am I? I'm a child of God. Maybe I don't have to obey God so that he might love me like a master loves a slave. Maybe he already loves me like a perfect father and loved me. And therefore I get to obey him. Therefore I want to obey him. And there was a huge difference in that. And so at this point, I began to see that there was a lot of truth and beauty that lay within the gospel of Christ. But so I had begun accepting it in here, but I had yet to accept it in here. At this point in my life, it was like if religions were like houses. I had left the house of Islam, I had wandered the streets for a few years, and now found myself at the house of Christ. And I had knocked, and the door had been swung wide open. I can see right inside, and I could almost see Jesus there at the table. He's prepared a feast for me right there. And there's a seat for me at his table, and he's saying, Reema, won't you come take your place? But I can't. I can't even bring myself to cross the threshold into the house. I just can't do it. Because I'm angry. I'm so angry. Because I'm learning about the supposed love of God, and I'm looking at my life, and I'm just thinking to myself, where? Where has your love been, God? One day I messaged one of my favorite Christian apologists. I just wanted to share with him, some of my journey this far, and I wasn't expecting an answer, but he actually responds, and he says, Reema, won't you come join me on Skype? And so I did. And so me and this apologist, we began having this conversation. In the middle of it, I just asked, if the truth is not that difficult to find, why is it that so many Muslims are still Muslims? He says, Reema, you just explained the circumstances of your life. Can't you see? By you accepting the gospel, you have nothing to lose now. But so many other Muslims do. What? But I thought about it, and it was really true. You see, I think about how many Muslims who actually do have good relationships with their friends and family and their community, and who by accepting the gospel, or even in trying to investigate it, that would mean for them in all likelihood risking losing those relationships. But you see, me, I didn't have the best childhood. Because of that, I no longer had any close ties to any of my Muslim community. And so I truly had no one and nothing to lose by accepting the gospel. And in that moment of realization, it was as if all of my life's curses were turning into blessings. And I could see the loving hand of God in my life. Maybe whatever joy I would have experienced in having a decent childhood, maybe the Lord knew the joy that I would have in coming to know Him would be far greater. Maybe God had been preparing me this entire time for this point in my life where all the evidence lay in front of me, and there would be nothing stopping me from accepting it. So coming off that Skype call, I knew that there was something I had to do. I got my running shoes on and went for my evening run. It was a beautiful night. Just actually right around sunset time. And part of my run at that point was to run over Pitt River Bridge, and so I did. And coming down that descent, man, I just felt so incredibly light and free, like all my chains has been broken. And get to the bottom of the bridge, and it's kind of right next to the highway, so I knew that I looked like a crazy person when I did this next part, but I didn't care. I dropped on my knees at that point, and I said, Jesus, I accept you as my Lord and my Savior, and I ask you, Lord, into my heart. I thank you for dying on the cross for my sins. And Lord, I love you, and I know you love me. On that day, I gave the keys of my life to Christ, and I said, just do with it what you please. Do whatever you want. And in that year, that first year that I accepted Christ, God had a lot to do, because the man that I was dating now sits here because he too accepted Christ. And we got engaged, and we got married. And at one point we got baptized together. And when the pastor at our church asked, Reema, why are you choosing to get baptized? I said, Terry, I went from being a slave of God to a child of God. And I have so much joy in that I want to share it with the entire world. And then I was buried with Christ and raised to new life. What I didn't realize at that point, though, was that when I was being raised to new life was being raised inside of me. Because that was the first day I was pregnant with my baby boy. And I had no idea until 4 weeks later. When I found out, we were so overjoyed. In that moment of excitement, I remember turning to God and thinking, Thank you, Lord, so much for this blessing. What should I name this child? And I heard so clearly, clearer than ever, the name Isaiah. And so I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I'd be having a boy, which I did, and that I would come to name him Isaiah, which I did. What I didn't realize was that the name Isaiah means Yahweh, the God of the Bible, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, is salvation. Yeah. How cool is that, right? A week before my son was born, I found myself called to the nursery I had set out for him, and it was very late at night, and I just felt to sit there in God's presence. And my sister comes to mind. You see, my sister hadn't spoken a word to me in the 5 years that I had left. And I had recently learned that she too had the courage to leave my parents. But she hadn't had the courage to reach out to me yet. And so I prayed that she would have the courage to reach out, that we'd be reconciled, and that we would have a good relationship. A week later, when I was in labor, I get a text. And for the first time in 5 years, it's my sister. She says, Reema, it's been a long time. And no time seems right, but I hear that you're in labor. Congratulations. I hope it goes well, and I hope that we can talk soon. And 7 months later, she's one of my best friends. 7 months later, she's one of the most active parts of my life and the best auntie for little Isaiah. You know, when I thought about how I might conclude my testimony earlier, I felt God whisper to me, Reema, your story is not over. There is so much work that God is still doing in my life. He's still working very actively to heal the wounds of my past and to restore life and hope to every area of my life that seemed hopeless and lifeless. You know, five years ago when I left my family, I thought that was the day that I would begin to experience my happiness and my freedom and my joy. But to be honest with you, I didn't experience a glimpse of any of those things until my Jesus walked through the door and he changed my life forever. Thank you guys for listening to my testimony today.